Hey guys, strap in because tonight we're pulling the crown tightening, slingshot swinging saga of David, the original underdog who turned a battlefield's mud into a meme-worthy victory, and somehow still managed to get a mixtape of psalms out of it. Before we dive in, smash that like button if you love a good, from shepherd to king, glow up, and drop a comment with your favorite underdog story. Maybe it's your own cat finally catching the red laser dot. Dim the lights, grab a coffee that's as bitter as Saul's jealousy, and picture yourself crouched in a cramped stone cave, the smell of goat skin and rusted armor thick enough to taste, while a distant drumbeat thunders like your heart before a job interview. You hear the shuffling of shepherds, the clink of a harp string, and suddenly a voice, gravelly, sarcastic, and oddly familiar, asks, "Do you really think a kid with a sling can take down a giant?" We'll spill the tea on how a boy who hid in fields, dodged the plague of politics, and wrote love letters to a deity in verse, is basically the ancient equivalent of a startup founder tweeting from a garage, except with more blood and fewer venture capitalists. So stay with me, because by the end you'll be able to quote a psalm faster than you can swipe left on your last Tinder match, and I promise you'll never look at a shepherd's crook the same way again. At the break of day, the hills of Bethlehem glowed amber as the first rooster cracked its ancient alarm. Young David crouched among a thicket of thorny scrub, his bare feet feeling the cool dew-slick stone beneath the goat skins he tended. The bleating of the flock rose like a low-key chorus, punctuated by the occasional rustle of a startled rabbit fleeing a wandering fox. He sang thin, lilting psalms that smelled of honey-sweet incense, his voice echoing off the craggy outcrops. Even the wind seemed to nudge him, whispering, "Hey kid, watch those wolves." One noon, a hulking bear nosed its way into the pasture, its shaggy fur bristling like an over-inflated inflatable costume at a Comic Con. David's heart hammered faster than a drum solo, yet a calm voice, soft as the rustle of olive leaves, wove through his mind, urging him to trust the shepherd of all shepherds. He seized his sling, scooped a smooth stone, and with a flick that would make a modern basketball player jealous, sent it whistling into the beast's snout. The bear toppled, stunned, and fled as if it had just been hit by a punchline nobody expected. Laughing, David muttered, "Who needs a bodyguard when you've got divine Wi-Fi?" Later that week, the prophet Samuel arrived, his sandals scuffing dust over the same path David had traced countless times. Samuel's eyes, sharp as a falcon's, lingered on the boy's scarred hands and the quiet confidence that clung to his shoulders like a well-worn cloak. With a trembling yet purposeful hand, he poured fragrant oil over David's head, the scent of myrrh spiraling upward like incense at a royal coronation, except the audience was a flock of bewildered sheep. The irony was palpable. The future king of Israel, crowned among goats, while the palace guards probably still thought shepherd meant seasonal lawn mower. As the oil dripped onto the dusty ground, David felt a fire ignite within, a destiny that would soon turn the very foundations of Jerusalem into a stage for miracles. The valley of Elah crackled with the heat of a summer noon, dust swirling like ghostly shrouds around the battlefield. From a ridge, the Philistine warlord Goliath thundered his challenge, his bronze armor clanking like a marching drumline and his voice echoing across the hills. The Israelites huddled behind a ragged fence, their faces slick with sweat and fear, as the giant's shadow stretched like a dark billboard over the camp. In that tense moment, a lanky shepherd boy named David slipped forward, his eyes bright with a confidence that made the older soldiers snort in disbelief. He carried only a humble sling, a leather strap worn smooth by countless sheep, and 5 river-smooth stones that glimmered like polished marbles. David crouched by the brook, the water cold against his bare feet, and plucked the first stone, feeling its cool weight against his palm. He whispered a quick prayer, the words buzzing in his throat like a secret ringtone, then slipped the stone into his sling with the practiced flick of a boy who'd chased goats through thorny hedges. The other soldiers muttered about the kid with a slingshot, as if he were about to launch a rubber band at the giant, but David's grin was as steady as a seasoned archer at a medieval archery tournament. When the moment arrived, he twirled the sling, the leather whirring like a hummingbird's wings, and released the stone, which sang through the air with a sharp whoosh. The projectile arced, glinting in the sun, and struck Goliath's forehead with a sound like a thunderclap meeting a tin can, a punchline written in stone. The giant's eyes widened in disbelief as the stone sank into his brow, and he staggered, the smell of fear and sweat mingling with the metallic tang of his own blood. Goliath's massive frame toppled, crashing to the ground with a thunderous thud that sent a plume of dust curling like a dramatic curtain drop. The Israelite camp erupted in a roar louder than any war cry, the jubilant shouts ricocheting off the hills, while some fled in terror, still unsure if they'd witnessed a miracle or a well-timed stunt. David stood, panting, his heart pounding like a war drum, and raised his sling in triumph, his simple faith turning the battlefield into a stage for an underdog story. From that day on, the name David echoed through the valleys, a reminder that a single stone, wielded with belief, could cast an entire nation's shadows into the light. After the Philistines crumbled beneath his sling, David swaggered into the glittering courtyard of Gibeah, his lyre slung over his shoulder like a rock star's guitar. The hall smelled of stale incense and sweat, and the clamor of armored men rattled the stone columns. When King Saul, brooding like a storm-clouded monarch, asked for a song, David's fingers coaxed a melody that rolled like honeyed rain over the tense crowd. The strings sang of triumph, and the king's hardened face softened, his eyes glimmering with a brief peace that smelled of fresh figs. Even the palace dogs hushed, as if the music had turned the battlefield into a lullaby. But the applause was a thin veneer over a simmering envy that boiled in Saul's gut, hotter than a desert fire. Each triumphant chord reminded the king of a younger, sharper blade wielded by a shepherd boy, an irony not lost on the soldiers who whispered, "Our king's playlist just got a new lead singer." Saul's grin cracked, and his hand tightened around his sword, the metal cold against his palm like a jealous lover's grip. He began to brood in the shadows, muttering prayers that sounded more like curses, his breath tasting of bitter herbs. The court, once a concert hall, now thrummed with a low, menacing hum, as if the walls themselves sensed the impending storm. One moonless night Saul's guards slipped through the palace gates, lanterns swaying like fireflies, and chased David into the wild thickets beyond the city's stone skin. The wilderness greeted him with the sharp scent of pine and the rasp of rustling leaves, a stark contrast to the polished marble he'd left behind. With each step, David felt the ground pulse under his boots, urging him to trust the unseen hand that had guided his sling years before. He knelt on cold, damp moss, whispered a prayer that rose like smoke, and the night air tightened around him, both terrifying and oddly comforting. In that wild, God's promise flickered like a candle in a storm, and David walked forward, heart beating like a war drum, ready for whatever the next verse might bring. The sun fell like a bruised orange over the ragged cliffs of the kingdom's edge, where David's ragtag band of outlaws had set up camp among twisted pine and the stench of damp leather. Night's chill bit into their boots as they whispered prayers, the flicker of campfire casting jittery shadows on hardened faces. David, still raw-skinned from the desert of his youth, surveyed the valley with eyes that seemed to glow, like a gamer's HUD overlay, but holy. He laughed low, noting that the enemy's armor clanged like an overenthusiastic drum line at a wedding, and his men cracked a grin despite the looming threat. The air tasted of pine resin and iron, a promise that the final showdown was about to ignite. When Saul's chariots thundered down the ridge, the ground trembled under hooves and metal, and the sky roared an angry chorus of gulls. David slipped a prayer into his pocket, then rolled his shoulder blade tightened band into a tight formation, turning the enemy's advance into a chaotic game of tag. By a whisper of divine counsel, think Siri with a halo, he ordered a flanking move through the narrow gorge, where rocks shredded wheels like a bad haircut. The Philistines stumbled, their shields clanged like broken cymbals, and a few fell into the cold stream, sending up spray that smelled of fish and fear. Even Saul's fiercest war cry was swallowed by the crackle of arrows and the guttural laughter of David's men, who sang a half-hearted rendition of "We Will Rock You" as they pressed forward. When the dust settled, the battlefield lay strewn with broken spears, blood-slicked earth, and the echo of destiny humming like a low-bass line. David stood on a bruised stone, his cloak fluttering, and the surviving soldiers fell silent as if a massive TV commercial had just cut to black. From the hill, a thunderous chorus rose, trumpets, shofars, and the distant howl of wolves, signaling the mantle of kingship sliding onto his shoulders like a perfectly timed meme caption. Saul's crown, tarnished and dented, was placed upon David's head. The weight felt less like metal and more like a promise, warm and heavy as a freshly baked loaf. With a grin that mixed triumph and humility, David raised his sword, the blade catching the fading light, and declared, "Let's get this kingdom party started." When David took the throne, the kingdom felt like a living tapestry, each thread a clash of swords or a hymn of praise. He marched through the dust-caked valleys of Judah, his sandals kicking up the scent of blood and rosemary, yet his eyes always lifted toward the mountain where God had whispered promises. Victories piled up like war trophies, a giant's head, a trembling Philistine, but each triumph tasted of iron, reminding him that glory was a fleeting guest. In quiet moments, he would sit on the palace steps, hum a psalm, and wonder if his heart was beating in sync with the Almighty's drum. David's grandest project wasn't a battlefield but a city, and he chose Jerusalem like a director picks the perfect stage for a blockbuster. He ordered the stone walls to rise, the hammer's clang ringing like a choir of clanging cymbals, while workers sweated under the relentless sun, their furrows smelling of fresh limestone and burnt incense. The city streets soon hummed with merchants hawking figs and goats, the aroma of spiced lamb mingling with the distant roar of temple bells. An ordinary market turned sacred arena. Ironically, the man who once slipped a stone to a giant now watched carpenters lay the foundation for a holy home, a place where even the most stubborn rebel could find a pew. When David's hair turned silver and his throne creaked, the kingdom's story spread like a gossip column that never faded, every scroll, every campfire tale chanting that he was a man after God's own heart. Children would giggle, recounting how he once danced barefoot under the night sky, his footfalls echoing like a drum solo, while elders whispered of his secret tears after losing a son, proving that even kings get the occasional heartbreak soundtrack. Scripture carved his name alongside his flaws, a reminder that greatness doesn't require a spotless armor but a soul willing to wrestle with the divine. And so, centuries later, when we hear "a man after God's own heart," we picture a king with a crown of thorns and a smile that could outshine a Hollywood blockbuster's finale. The night the decree went up, the air in Goshen tasted of scorching sand and whispered dread. A desperate mother cradled her newborn, the baby's cries muffled by reeds, and slipped him into a waterproof basket that bobbed like a shy duck on the dark Nile. The river's current sang a low, relentless lullaby, pushing the tiny vessel past papyrus reeds that smelled of fresh mud and lilies. Somewhere downstream, The water's secret kept the infant safe, while Egyptian soldiers patrolled the banks with spears glinting like sunrise. In that floating cradle, the baby's Hebrew blood pulsed beneath the reeds, a hidden rhythm beneath the river's roar. At dawn, a princess with a crown that sparkled like a disco ball, if ancient Egypt had a club scene, spotted the basket drifting like a rogue souvenir. She lifted it with a graceful sigh, half amused, half horrified, as the reeds slapped the wooden slats with a squeaky protest. Inside, the infant blinked, his tiny fists clutching at the air as if auditioning for a future showdown with Pharaoh's law. The princess, delighted by her unexpected gift from the gods, named him Moses, unaware she was adopting a future rebel on a baby snuggle level. She tucked him into her silk-lined chambers, where perfume and incense swirled, while the palace drums thumped obliviously to the irony of a Hebrew heir riding the Egyptian high chair. Years later, Moses grew into a lanky, quick-witted prince, his sandals scuffing marble floors while his ears still caught the faint echo of Hebrew lullabies his mother once sang. Every festival feast, every gold-scented incense burn, left a faint aftertaste of sand and the distant memory of reeds rustling in his mind. He laughed at the court's jokes, but a quiet undercurrent, like the Nile's hidden current, pulled at his heart, reminding him of a people he'd never seen but whose cries lingered in the courtyard's shadows. The irony was thick. A future deliverer, raised on royal delicacies, still felt the sting of his people's oppression like a sand grain between his teeth. In those moments, the river's secret whispered, "Remember who you are," setting the stage for the daring journey that would turn a prince into a legend. Moses stood on the banks of the Nile, the sun turning the water into molten gold, while the sound of cracked whips cracked louder than a street musician's drum solo. He watched the Israelites labor under the weight of stone and sorrow, their skin slick with sweat and dust, their eyes flickering like candle flames in a storm. The sight lit a fire in his chest, a burning question that whispered, "Why am I watching this tragedy like a Netflix binge?" He felt the sting of guilt coil around his throat, as thick as the incense that rose from the Pharaoh's palace. In that moment, the prince-born son of Israel decided the only answer was to act, even if it meant breaking the royal script. When an Egyptian overseer raised his cruel hand against a trembling Israelite, Moses lunged, his heart pounding like a drum beat in a battle video game. The blade flashed, the overseer crumpled, and the courtyard echoed with a gasp that sounded like a shocked crowd at a surprise season finale. Fear surged through Moses, hot and sharp as desert sand, and he sprinted across the palace grounds, the clang of his sandals a frantic soundtrack. He slipped through the city gates, leaving behind a trail of blood, shame, and a royal decree that read, "Catch the runaway. He's hotter than a summer mixtape." By nightfall, the desert winds carried his scent of panic and pine, guiding him toward an unknown horizon. The desert welcomed him like an over-caffeinated barista, buzzing with the scent of sagebrush and the distant bleating of goats. Jethro, the Midianite priest, opened his tent and offered Moses a seat beside a fire that crackled like a vinyl record warming up. Over spiced stew, Moses met Zipporah, whose laughter sparkled brighter than a holographic selfie filter, and soon he traded a throne for a shepherd's crook, feeling the rough rope of the staff against his palm. Days melted into nights as he guided flocks over craggy cliffs, the wind whipping his beard, the sun baking his back, each sunrise teaching patience louder than any courtroom. In that quiet, wool-filled world, the future deliverer honed his voice, learning that leadership is less about thunderous speeches and more about the gentle hum of a flock finding its way home. Moses trudged up the craggy slopes of Mount Horeb, the air thin and smelling of scorched stone, when a sudden blaze leapt from a humble bush and refused to devour it. The fire crackled like a restless crowd at a rock concert, yet the green leaves stayed stubbornly intact, as if the flame were humming a silent hymn. From the ember-bright chorus, a voice boomed, "Moses, my son, stand still," startling him more than the heat ever could. The voice swirled around him like a desert wind, promising a destiny that would yank him from his royal comforts into a saga of exodus. Moses stared at the fire like a rookie on a game show, wondering if he'd been handed the ultimate cheat code. "Who am I?" he asked, his voice trembling, as if he'd just been asked to explain why the Wi-Fi was down in the desert. God laughed, well, the voice did, by turning Moses' polished staff into a slithering snake, a reptile that hissed louder than a backstage argument. Then the same staff, when placed on Moses' palm, made his hand turn as white as a mummy's wrappings, a miracle so vivid it could have sold tickets for a special effects demo. After the signs, the divine messenger slipped a scroll into Moses' hands, the parchment crackling like dry leaves underfoot, and laid out a plan to confront a tyrant named Pharaoh with 10 plagues that would make even the fiercest Netflix series look tame. The ground beneath Moses seemed to tremble with the weight of 1,000 Israelites watching him from the dunes, their hopes as palpable as the dust that clung to his sandals. Swallowing his royal doubts, he lifted his gaze to the horizon, where the Red Sea waited like a giant, blue curtain ready to part for a dramatic entrance. With a determined sigh that smelled of incense and sweat, Moses stepped down from the mountain, ready to trade his prince's silk for a deliverer's rugged sandals. Moses stood before the golden throne of Pharaoh, the heat of the palace kitchens curling like a lazy dragon around his sandals. He lifted his rod, eyes flashing with a storm that had been brewing for 45 years, and announced the first plague, a river turned to blood, smelling of copper and rot. When the Nile ooze splashed the palace steps, the courtiers gaped, their silk robes sticking to their skin like wet napkins. Pharaoh snorted, declaring, "Another trick. Fine, bring on your frogs," as a chorus of rib-croaking amphibians flooded the palace courtyard, turning the floor into a soggy swamp. Moses, with a wry grin, muttered that even the gods needed a good PR stunt. And the next night the sky darkened with a swarm of locusts that sounded like 1,000 broken speakers at a rock concert. At dawn, the Israelites slipped out of Egypt, their sandals scraping the dusty road while the air smelled of cumin and sweat. Behind them, Pharaoh's chariots thundered like a fleet of Formula One cars on sand, their drivers shouting curses that ricocheted off the stone walls. The crowd's panic tasted like iron, and children clutched their mothers' skirts, feeling the sudden weight of every step as if the ground itself were trying to swallow them. Moses, his staff clenched like a microphone, raised his voice and sang a low, guttural chant that seemed to push the desert wind into a reluctant ally. Just when the Israelites thought they'd be trampled, a sudden, eerie stillness fell, and the Egyptians' engines sputtered, as if someone had hit the pause button on a Netflix binge. The sea roared ahead, a hulking wall of salt water that sprayed a briny mist onto the faces of the fleeing Israelites, tasting like tears and seaweed. Moses planted his staff into the sand, shouted, "Part," and the water obeyed, splitting into twin towers of liquid glass that shimmered like neon billboards on a midnight highway. The Israelites marched through the dry seabed, feeling the gritty sand crunch beneath their feet, while the air crackled with a static charge that made their hair stand on end. Behind them, the Egyptian army barreled in, their helmets clanking, only to watch in horror as the sea walls collapsed with a deafening roar, swallowing chariots like a hungry shark devouring a surfboard. When the waters surged back, a thunderous applause from the heavens echoed, and Moses, dripping with seawater, laughed, whispering that even the biggest blow-ups can have a spectacularly wet ending. The sun beat down on the jagged ribs of Mount Sinai, turning the sandstone into a furnace that sang with the hiss of distant winds. Moses, his sandals dust-caked and his beard flapping like a weather-ed banner, clambered up the steep path, every step a reminder of the desert's unforgiving grin. He paused at the summit, where clouds gathered like a reluctant audience, and the air smelled of pine resin and burnt offering. Below, the Israelites trudged through a sea of sand, grumbling like a chorus of teenagers stuck in a never-ending field trip. Yet Moses felt a strange calm, as if the mountain itself were handing him a backstage pass to the ultimate showdown. Suddenly, the sky split with a thunderclap that could have been God's own drum solo, and fire ribbons laced the rock, illuminating a stone tablet that glowed hotter than a smartphone left in a car. Moses reached out, his fingers brushing the etching, and the words, 10 sharp, unyielding commandments, etched themselves into his mind like a pop-up ad you can't close. The fire crackled, the wind howled, and a fragrant olive oil scent drifted up, mingling with the metallic tang of fear and awe. He stared at the tablets, half expecting them to start scrolling like a tablet device, but the divine script stayed stubbornly ancient. In that blaze, laughter twitched at the edge of his thoughts. How ironic that the stubborn lawgiver would be delivered via a literal stone tablet. With the tablets cradled like fragile relics, Moses descended, his cloak billowing and his heart thumping louder than the desert drums. He gathered the people beneath a canvas of night, where stars blinked like the audience at a concert, and proclaimed the covenant, a handshake across centuries, sealed with fire and blood-dry promises. The Israelites listened, their faces a mix of relief, confusion, and the kind of hope that tastes like rain after drought. Moses stood there, not just a prince who escaped a palace, but a lawgiver who could turn sand into scripture, cementing his role as the enduring deliverer. And as the first dawn painted the horizon in gold, even the desert seemed to nod, whispering, "Game on, Moses. Let's see how you write the next chapter." The marble corridors of Persepolis thrummed with the clatter of sandals and the sweet perfume of frankincense, a backdrop for a secret contest that smelled more like a royal talent show than a beauty pageant. Young Esther, an orphan with hair the color of midnight wheat, slipped through the palace doors clutching a faded sack of figs her uncle had sent her. The king's eunuchs, flamboyant as runway judges, whispered about the next queen, while the courtiers giggled like gossiping teenagers at a TikTok dance challenge. Esther's eyes darted over glittering mirrors, feeling the cool touch of polished bronze against her fingertips, and she wondered if destiny had just swiped right on her life. Little did she know, the very walls that echoed her heartbeat were also listening to a darker plot brewing in the shadows. In the grand hall, draped in silks that rustled like a desert wind, candidates paraded before King Ahasuerus, each trying to outshine the last with pearls, poetry, and pratfalls. Haman, the king's chief advisor, watched from his perch, his smile as thin as a razor blade, nursing a secret grudge that festered like sour grapes left in the sun. He muttered about the Jews with a venomous whisper that could have rattled the palace's chandeliers, yet the courtiers laughed, assuming his drama was just another episode of palace intrigue. As Esther brushed a stray lock of hair, the scent of roasted lamb mingled with the metallic tang of fear that clung to Haman's robe. The irony was thick. The kingdom celebrated beauty while its future villain was busy drafting a doom scroll of deadly decrees. The moment arrived when the king, eyes gleaming like polished onyx, sent out a golden scroll, an invitation that read like a party flyer, promising wine, music, and a night to remember. Esther's heart hammered against her ribs, a drumbeat that drowned out the distant clatter of Haman's quill scratching ominous letters. She slipped into the palace garden, feeling the cool marble under her feet, and the whisper of roses that tried to mask the stench of impending betrayal. As the moon rose, the banquet erupted in laughter, the clink of goblets, and a chorus of voices oblivious to the storm gathering on the horizon. In that glittering moment, Esther stood poised between fate and folly, a queen in training who would soon turn a royal invitation into a rescue mission for her people. Esther glides through the marble corridors of the palace, the sun catching the gilt on the columns and turning the polished floor into a river of liquid gold. Behind her, a hush of silk whispers like gossiping courtiers, while the scent of spiced incense twists around her like an invisible scarf. Mordecai, his beard brushing the hem of his robe, leans in and drops the news. Haman is plotting a decree that would wipe out every Jew in the kingdom. The revelation hits her like a royal spoiler on Netflix, shocking and oddly thrilling in its danger. She feels the weight of the crown settle heavier, a cold metal reminder that her beauty is now tangled with a looming catastrophe. Haman, smug as a palace chef who just invented a new dish, has already inked the edict, ready to seal it with the king's signet, a stamp as massive as a cannonball and twice as unforgiving. The scribes tap their quills in a relentless staccato, the wax dripping onto parchment with a scent of burnt sugar and bureaucracy. Ironically, the king adores Esther's laughter, yet his ears are clogged by the clamor of feasts and flutes, oblivious to the murderous agenda brewing in his own chambers. Esther feels a bead of sweat roll down her temple, the cool air of the courtyard doing nothing to calm the fire building inside her. The palace walls seem to pulse with the threat, each stone echoing the unspoken question, will she stay silent or speak up? Instead of shrinking, Esther squares her shoulders and decides to turn the whispers into a roar, recalling a line from an old scroll. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. She summons her most regal composure, ready to stride before the king like a Beyoncé entrance, high heels clacking on marble, eyes locked on the throne. The doors to the royal court loom ahead, massive oak breathing out the scent of ancient cedar, while the palace courtiers exchange nervous glances as if a drama series were about to climax. With each step, she feels the pulse of her people thudding in her chest, louder than any drum of war. This queen will not let the ink of genocide dry on parchment. She will speak, and the palace will hear her voice reverberate like a battle cry. Late in the palace courtyard, Mordecai unrolled a trembling scroll, its parchment crackling like dry leaves underfoot, and read the king's decree that Haman had signed with a flourish of murderous intent. The ink smelled of metal and fear, and the words promised the annihilation of every Jew in the kingdom, a nightmare as vivid as a horror movie marathon. He slammed the parchment onto the stone floor, startling a nearby guard who muttered, "Did someone order a plot twist?" With a fierce glint in his eye, Mordecai raced to Esther's chambers, chanting, "You're queen, but you're also our last hope. Go and bargain with the king." The urgency of his voice echoed against the marble, leaving Esther with a decision that could tilt the fate of an entire people. Esther stared at the royal seal, feeling the cool marble of the balcony bite through her silk sash, and the court's murmurs swirled around her like a gossip podcast she'd never subscribed to. She knew that appearing before King Ahasuerus without an invitation was a death sentence, essentially a royal version of walking into a meeting that ends with "you're fired" written in blood. A nervous chuckle escaped her as she imagined the king's bewildered face when she barged in. "Surprise! I'm here uninvited, and I've brought a crisis that'll make your latest banquet look like a potluck." Yet the thought of her people trembling in the shadows of the city's alleys made her heart pound louder than the palace drums. Gathering courage like a warrior clutching a shield, she whispered a prayer, letting faith rise like the scent of incense burning in the night. With a resolve as firm as the king's golden scepter, Esther summoned the women of the palace. their laughter soft as rustling silk, and declared a 3-day fast that turned the palace kitchens into a quiet battlefield of empty platters and bitter herbs. The air grew thick with the aroma of longing, and each whispered prayer rose like incense, stitching courage into the very walls of the throne room. When at last she slipped through the jeweled doors, she found the king reclined on his throne, his hand still clutching a goblet that smelled of honeyed wine, unaware that his queen was about to rewrite destiny. "If I have found favor," she began, her voice steady as a drumbeat, "let it be to save my people, not to serve a snack." The irony was sweet. Her bold gamble would turn the would-be executioner into a humbled footstool, and the empire would remember the night a queen traded a royal invitation for a miracle. When the palace courier whispered the royal decree, Esther felt her heart thud like a drumbeat in a rock concert. She slipped into the women's quarters, where the air smelled of incense and stale laundry, and began a 3-day fast that would make a keto diet look like a snack. Each sunrise she knelt on the cold stone floor, whispering prayers that rose like incense smoke, pleading for courage louder than a Netflix trailer voice-over. The queen-to-be imagined herself as a lone heroine in an action movie, except the villain wore a regal robe instead of a cape. She vowed that if she survived the king's wrath, she'd stand before him, even if it cost her crown, her life, or at least a bad hair day. When the day arrived, Esther swayed through the golden halls, the marble cool beneath her sandals, while guards clanged like an over-eager drumline. The throne room pulsed with the scent of spiced wine and heated tallow, a backdrop that would make any yoga studio seem serene by comparison. She bowed low enough that the hem of her veil brushed the polished floor, feeling the weight of 1,000 whispered, what-ifs, tickle her ears. King Ahasuerus lounged on his throne, his beard glittering with a garnish of gold dust, as if he just walked off a Renaissance meets Marvel movie set. Esther's voice trembled like a trembling bass line, but she steadied it with a grin, thinking, "If I'm going down, at least I'll have a good story for the next family reunion." At last she whispered, "My people are in danger," and revealed the scarlet seal of her Jewish heritage, a badge as bold as any superhero emblem. The king's eyebrows shot up like startled pigeons, and Haman's smile cracked, tasting sour as bruised grapes. Esther unfurled the scroll that exposed Haman's plot, the parchment rustling like the opening credits of a thriller. Ahasuerus slammed his scepter down, the sound echoing like a thunderclap, and commanded Haman's downfall with the same swiftness a director yells "cut" after a perfect take. The conspirator's fate was sealed, hanged on the very gallows he'd prepared for Esther, proving that a queen's quiet prayer can outshoot any blockbuster climax. When King Ahasuerus slammed the royal seal on a fresh edict, the palace courtyard erupted in a chorus of clacking armor and nervous shuffles. The decree, bold as a war cry, gave every Jew the right to raise a shield and a sword against any who dared strike them. He ordered the city gates to stay open, the market stalls to spill over with figs and the scent of spiced lamb, while messengers sprinted on foot and camel, their sandals kicking up dust like the beat of a drum. In the shadows, Esther watched the ink dry, her heart thudding like a war drum, knowing that this very decree turned a threat into a battlefield of hope. The next sunrise saw Haman's name carved into the palace's execution board, a grim ledger that glittered with irony. He'd plotted to erase a people, only to be erased himself. Soldiers dragged him to the gallows, the rope creaking like an old harp, while the crowd muttered prayers that smelled of incense and sweat. As the blade fell, a hush fell over the marble hall, broken only by a stray cat slipping through a tapestry, as if even the palace pets sensed the twist of fate. The king, half amused and half terrified, declared the decree irreversible, and the echo of Hammond's downfall rippled through the streets like a gossip meme in an ancient Instagram. From that day on, the Jews marked the date with a feast they called Purim, a carnival of drums, honey-drenched pastries, and storytellers who shouted Esther's name louder than a karaoke bar. Children dressed as mock royals, their costumes rustling like silk sheets, while elders lifted cups of wine that glittered like spilled moonlight, toasting the queen who turned a royal papyrus into a salvation script. The air buzzed with laughter, the pop culture chant of Esther 1, Hammond 0, echoing between booths selling fried dough that smelled like fried gold. Each year, as fireworks crackle over the city walls, the memory of that faithful stand glows brighter than any torch, reminding everyone that a single brave whisper can rewrite an empire's headline. In the bustling shadows of Jerusalem's temple courts, Saul stalked the stone-paved lanes like a zealot on a mission, his linen robe rustling against the midday heat. He clutched a scroll of the law, its papyrus edges crisp as fresh-baked flatbread, and his eyes burned with the fire of a Pharisee who thought he was the universe's quality control inspector. Every shouted prayer from the priests echoed in his ears, a soundtrack that steadied his resolve as he swore to protect the covenant. The air was thick with incense, and the sour stink of animal sacrifice, a perfume that reminded him he was literally standing on holy ground. Yet beneath his polished facade, a hard-baked heart beat like a drum in a marching band, ready to crush any whisper of the new way. One humid evening, Saul gathered a troop of fellow zealots and stormed the home of a humble carpenter's son, their boots slapping the cobblestones like a drumline in a toga party. They burst through the doorway, shouting curses that sounded like bad subtitles in a dystopian movie, while the flickering oil lamp sputtered and cast wild shadows on the walls. The smell of spilled wine and fear mingled with the metallic tang of blood as they seized a handful of trembling believers, pinning them to a wooden bench as though auditioning for a crucifixion cosplay. Saul's voice cracked like a broken lyre as he demanded the followers renounce their heretical chants, his words ricocheting off the stone arches like a badly timed echo in a subway tunnel. The crowd's murmurs turned into a guttural chorus of defiance, the scent of rebellion hanging heavier than the incense. Back in the courtyard, Saul stood triumphant, his chest puffed out as if he just scored the winning touchdown in a game of divine dodgeball. He believed each confiscated scroll was a victory badge, a shiny sticker he could plaster on the walls of his conscience. Yet the echo of the followers' whispered prayers lingered like a catchy pop song stuck in his head. The iron bars of the cell clanged, the cold stone pressed against his palm, and for a fleeting moment his hardened heart flickered, just enough to feel the sting of irony that the very law he defended was now a chain around his own soul. The night air smelled of roasted figs and regret, and Saul, unaware of the looming thunderstorm of grace, swaggered away, his sandals squeaking like a sitcom laugh track. Little did he know that the shadows of the law were about to crack, letting a blinding light slice through the darkness of his own making. Saul strapped his soldier's cloak tight and mounted his dusty camel, the road to Damascus stretching like a cracked skin of the desert. He imagined the smug satisfaction of hauling a sack of prisoners back to Jerusalem, his mind humming with the triumph of a Roman-style bounty hunter. The sun beat down, turning the sand into a sizzling skillet, while the wind carried the acrid scent of goat dung and distant market spices. Every hoofbeat hammered his zeal, and a private joke in his head whispered that even a Netflix binge couldn't compete with this drama. Yet beneath the bravado, a thin tremor of doubt rattled his chest like a loose armor plate. Out of nowhere, a blinding light slammed into his eyes, brighter than a Hollywood premiere's flashbulb and hotter than a midsummer barbecue. Saul slammed his hand over his face, the sand scorching his palms, while the sound of a divine voice cracked the silence like a broken record. "Saul, why do you persecute me?" the voice asked, reverberating through his skull, turning his thoughts into a tangled knot of fear and curiosity. The heat pulsed, the earth seemed to sigh, and a metallic taste of copper swirled in his mouth, a cocktail of terror and awe. For a heartbeat his whole crusade flickered like a dying phone battery. And the irony wasn't lost on the heavens that the man who chased believers now faced a divine reality check. Saul collapsed onto the gritty road, the sand biting his skin as if it were 1,000 tiny needles of disbelief. His armor clanged like a sitcom laugh track, and the blood that seeped from a scraped knee mingled with the dust, seasoning the moment with raw reality. In that helpless sprawl, his old identity cracked open, the relentless soldier inside sobbing into the wind while a new purpose whispered like a soft mixtape. He heard the distant chatter of the city, the clamor of market stalls, but inside his head the voice of Christ lingered, turning his fury into a fresh mission. From that day onward, Saul would swap his sword for scripture, his name a brand upgrade from persecutor to apostle, the ultimate character development arc. The night Saul fell, the world turned to a black velvet curtain, his eyes burning like a busted LCD screen. He stumbled, hands groping the cobblestones, until a meek voice whispered, "Come, the Lord has a message for you." Ananias, a carpenter-turned-prophet, appeared as if summoned by an ancient GPS, leading Saul through the smell of incense and damp stone. The journey felt like a blindfolded escape room, every step echoing with the clatter of his old persecutor's shoes. By the time they reached the modest doorway, Saul's heart hammered louder than a drum solo at a rock concert. When Ananias laid his trembling hand on Saul's shoulder, a sudden flash of light burst through the darkness, like a superhero's power-up, and his sight snapped back. The courtyard erupted with the scent of oil and the rustle of linen as the Holy Spirit poured over him, inflaming his veins with a warmth that tasted like fresh baked bread. Without a moment's hesitation, Saul dove into the nearest spring, letting the cold water cascade over his scarred skin while he declared, "I'm baptized." He burst into the synagogues, voice cracking like a broken record but alive with fire, preaching the gospel to anyone who would listen. The congregation squinted, half confused, half amazed, as if they'd been handed a vintage mixtape of Jesus's teachings on a modern playlist. Yet the applause was thin. The same friends who'd once handed him swords now stared at him with raised eyebrows and clenched fists. Saul felt the irony of his new mission, like a former corporate lawyer suddenly selling vegan smoothies on a street corner. Their whispers ricocheted off the stone walls, dripping with suspicion, and the faint stink of stale wine. He wrestled with the ache of betrayal, each argument a tug of war between his old armor and the soft coat of grace now draped over his shoulders. In the end, the only thing he could hear was the steady thrum of the Spirit, urging him onward, louder than any doubter's hiss. Paul pressed his foot into the cracked limestone road of Ephesus, the sun beating down like an angry overseer. The salty breeze from the harbor scraped his cheek as merchants shouted over piles of fragrant figs and oil. Once the notorious Saul, he now wore the simple wool of a preacher, a far cry from his former courtroom drama. Think Better Call Saul, but with fewer suits and more sandals. Each mile across Asia Minor felt like stepping through a storm of doubt, the distant clatter of Roman hooves echoing his own restless heartbeat. Yet the promise of the gospel crackled in his veins, hotter than the embered hearths he passed. In Corinth, a mob of angry philosophers hurling wine-stained arguments at him like rotten grapes, their voices rising to a roar that rattled the marble columns. Paul dodged a Roman centurion spear thrust, the cold iron grazing his sleeve and sending a shiver through his spine. Inside, his mind churned with questions. Was he a bold apostle or a reckless wanderer, a modern-day Marty McFly lost in ancient traffic? The scent of incense mixed with sweat and cheap wine, creating a heady cocktail that made his throat feel raw. Still, he answered each accusation with a tongue sharpened by scripture, turning hostility into a strange, gritty sermon. Finally, the journey culminated in Jerusalem, where the council gathered beneath flickering oil lamps whose waxy glow painted trembling shadows on stone. The crowd's murmurs swelled like a distant sea, while the smell of incense and old parchment clung to the air like an ancient perfume. Paul rose, his voice steady as a war drum, and laid out his defense with the confidence of a seasoned storyteller. Imagine a stand-up comic delivering a theological punchline. The Roman governor's stern gaze softened for a heartbeat, then hardened again. But Paul kept his eyes fixed on the scrolls, feeling every word carve a new path through his doubts. When he finished, a hush fell, louder than any storm, and the council's assent rang out like applause after a climactic scene. The narrow stone cell in Caesarea smelled of damp earth and the sharp tang of iron from the chains that clanged like a stubborn metronome. Yet Paul, his beard dusted with the grit of long journeys, seized a quill and hammered out epistles that tasted of fire and hope. He penned verses that wrapped around faith like a warm shawl, stitched with threads of grace that glittered even in the gloom. The clamor of guards outside became a distant drumbeat as he whispered unity to imagined congregations across the Mediterranean. In that dim, cramped darkness, the apostle's words sparked a lantern that would outshine the prison walls for centuries. Ironically, the same man who once brandished swords against believers now wielded ink as his new weapon of love. He recalled the night he slammed the doors of the temple, now laughing at the memory like a sitcom flashback, where the villain becomes the hero. The transformation felt less like a miracle and more like a cosmic reboot, a software update from Persecutor Vone to Apostle 2 with a smoother interface. Each letter drummed the message that grace could melt stone hearts, turning stubborn stone into soft, pliable clay. Listeners felt the shock of that irony, like hearing a bass drop after a solemn hymn, and they sang along, surprised yet rejoicing. Paul's missives traveled on weather-worn scrolls, rust-kissed seashells, and the gossip-filled tongues of merchants, leaving a trail of light that flickered in every cathedral and coffee shop alike. Today, you might catch a teenager quoting Romans while scrolling TikTok, proving that ancient ink can still go viral. The legacy of his light shines in every hymn that rises like smoke from a candle, in every hug shared across denominational lines, and in the quiet sigh of a believer finding peace. Scholars trace his influence like detectives following a scent trail of parchment. Yet the real power lies in the simple feeling that grace can turn a scarred soul into a beacon. So when the world feels heavy, remember Paul's cell, a cramped closet of conviction that birthed a legacy brighter than any spotlight on Broadway. The dust-kissed lanes of Bethlehem smelled of barley and goat milk as Naomi's battered cart creaked into the village square. She was a widow draped in worn shawls, her eyes the color of dried figs, and behind her trailed the quiet footsteps of two foreign daughters-in-law. Orpah, with a laugh that sounded like the clatter of a market stall, glanced back at Moab's sun-baked hills, while Ruth clutched the edge of her cloak as if it were a lifeline. Children darted past, shouting a game of tag that echoed like a distant drum, and the wind rattled the wheat stalks, whispering of a harvest yet to come. The scene felt like an ancient sitcom, Naomi the weary host, Orpah the cameo guest, and Ruth the unexpected series regular. When the dusk settled, Orpah slipped away like a thief in a midnight tavern, her departure marked by a soft sigh that drifted over the fields. Ruth turned to Naomi, her fingers stained with the grit of the road, and proclaimed with fierce resolve, "Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay." The words cracked through the cool air as sharply as a stone thrown at a glass jar of honey, sealing a bond that outshone any family pact. Naomi's heart, bruised by loss, flickered like a candle in a windstorm, yet Ruth's pledge sparked a stubborn flame that refused to be snuffed. Even the stubborn goat seemed to pause, ears perked, as if the universe had just clicked the play button on a drama destined for redemption. The harvest field stretched golden beyond the town, each stalk swaying like a chorus line waiting for the maestro's cue. As they walked together, the scent of ripe wheat mingled with the tang of earth, reminding them that providence often hides in the mundane grind of daily toil. Ruth's steadfast love rolled over Naomi like a warm blanket, wrapping the old woman in a promise that felt both ancient and oddly modern. Think soul-mate vibes, but with more barley. The irony was delicious. A Moabite woman, once a foreigner, now became the secret weapon in Naomi's quiet rebellion against fate. In that moment, the field seemed to whisper, "Stay tuned," as divine guidance prepared to turn a simple pledge into a story sung for generations. At first light, Ruth slipped beyond the stone walls of Naomi's modest home, her sandals kicking up a thin veil of dust that smelled of stale figs and sunrise. The road to the field stretched like a tired river, its edges lined with wild thyme that whispered secrets to the wind. Naomi's counsel echoed in her ears, "Go, my daughter, and glean where the grain is sweet, for the Lord will watch over you." Ruth's heart hammered against her ribs as she entered Boaz's vineyard, the rows of vines standing tall like soldiers in a green army. The sun lifted, turning the dew-kissed stalks into glittering spears of gold, and she lowered herself to the ground, scooping the fallen kernels with calloused hands. Boaz, the master of the estate, spotted Ruth from the far end of the vineyard, his eyebrows arching like the gates of a castle as he watched her diligence. He strode over, his cloak rustling louder than a royal entrance, and called out a greeting that rolled like a warm loaf of bread fresh from the oven. "Fear not, daughter of Naomi," he declared, waving a hand that seemed to shield her from the prying eyes of other gleaners. "Pick freely, and I will leave extra sheaves for you." A grin cracked his weather-worn face, a humor as dry as the season's last rye, and he instructed his foreman to leave a pile of barley stacked like a tiny fortress just for her. As Ruth gathered the bounty, the scent of grain mingled with the sweet perfume of ripe grapes, and she felt a flicker of hope bright enough to outshine the scorching noon. Back at Naomi's hearth, the matriarch's eyes widened like a surprised cat when Ruth presented the overflowing basket, the grain spilling over like a cascade of tiny suns. Naomi clutched the sack to her chest, whispering a prayer that sounded like a mixtape of gratitude and relief, marveling at how Boaz's kindness seemed scripted by divine providence itself. She chuckled, noting the irony that the very man who once might have been a distant relative now played the role of a benevolent landlord, almost like a biblical version of a superhero landlord who actually cares about the tenants. The night air grew cooler, carrying the faint aroma of roasted chickpeas from the village market, and Naomi felt a steady pulse of redemption beating in her bones. With each bite of the fresh grain, she tasted not just sustenance, but the promise that even the bleakest fields can bear fruit when loyalty and love tend the soil. The moon hung low over the thrashing floor, a silver disk that turned the wheat stalks into ghostly sea foam. Ruth slipped through the night air, the scent of freshly beaten grain prickling her nostrils like pepper spray, her cloak rustling against the coarse thatch. Naomi's daring scheme throbbed in her heart, a drumbeat that urged her forward despite the cold that bit at her fingers. She found Boaz hunched over the heap, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the fire's orange glow, and she gathered the courage to step into the grain-laden arena. The silence was broken only by the distant howl of a stray dog, a reminder that even the night had ears. She knelt on the ground, the straw crunching beneath her as she whispered the plea that Naomi had rehearsed. "Spread your wing over my kin, be my redeemer." Bose looked up, his eyes widening like someone who just discovered a hidden Easter egg in a video game, and a smile tugged at his beard. The honesty in her voice hit him harder than a sack of barley, and he felt the weight of her loyalty settle on his chest like a warm cloak. He rose, his hands still dusted with grain, and promised to act, his tone steady but tinged with the irony of a man who'd never expected a foreign widow to gate-crash his midnight snack. Yet the law of levirate marriage was a tangled web, and he knew he couldn't just swipe right on destiny. Bose explained that a senior kinsman held the first right of redemption, a sort of ancient first-come-first-served queue that could make or break Ruth's hope. He would have to call the relative, a man whose reputation for stinginess rivaled a miser who hoards Wi-Fi passwords, and ask if he would waive his claim. The thought of waiting for a reply felt like standing in a line for the latest iPhone, excruciating and full of anticipation. Yet the firelight danced on the grain, and Ruth's eyes shone with a fierce determination that made Bose's heart pound like a drum in a festival. As the night stretched on, the promise of redemption hung in the air, fragrant as barley honey, waiting for the next sunrise to settle the score. The sun blazed over the thrashing floor as the senior kinsman, clad in a robe that had seen more harvests than a veteran Instagram influencer, stepped forward. He cleared his throat, and the murmuring crowd fell silent like a paused TV commercial. With a sigh that smelled of stale barley and old regret, he announced he would not take up the redemption, his voice cracking like a cracked pottery jar. The elders exchanged glances, half amused and half relieved, for none wanted to be the reluctant superhero forced to carry the family line. In that moment, the empty field seemed to sigh, the dust rising like the curtain call of a drama. When Bose, the plump and generous owner of the neighboring estate, heard the refusal, he crossed the dusty path with a swagger that reminded the onlookers of a knight in a low-budget period costume. He lifted his hand, feeling the rough bark of the gatepost, and declared his intent to redeem Naomi's line, his words ringing clear as a hammered tambourine. The crowd erupted in cheers that sounded like a village barbershop quartet, and Ruth stepped beside him, eyes bright as fresh figs. Their marriage was sealed under a sky smeared with twilight pink, the scent of crushed wheat and goat milk mingling with the faint whiff of hope. Even the village gossipers joked that this romance had more plot twists than a binge-watched streaming series, yet the love felt as solid as a stone wall. As the new couple walked home, the village women tossed wheat stalks into the air, creating a golden rain that tickled the couple's cheeks. Naomi, whose heart had been a cavern of grief, felt a sudden rush of tears that tasted salty like the sea-sprayed wind on the coast of Gaza. The elders whispered that divine providence had finally set the table, a banquet of redemption served on a humble wooden platter. Children laughed, their laughter crackling like dry firewood, while the elders nodded, their eyes twinkling with the kind of irony only history can afford. Who would have thought a Moabite woman and a Bethlehem landowner would rewrite the family ledger? In that twilight glow, the future of Ruth and Bose glimmered, promising grain-filled granaries and generations that would tell this story around hearths for ages. The sun poured amber over Bethlehem as Naomi cradled a newborn swaddled in coarse wool, the air thick with the perfume of goat's milk and fresh earth. Midwives whispered prayers, their voices mingling with the bleating of sheep and the cracked rhythm of the village well. When the baby's first cry cut through the din, Naomi's heart swelled like a drumbeat, a thunderous finally that startled even the nearby sparrows. She named him Obed, meaning servant, and felt a secret fire flicker, an echo of promise that would someday rock the throne of Israel. Little did she know that this squat bundle would become the grandfather of the future rock star king, David, whose harp would later outsing any courtly lute. Ruth, the Moabite firebrand, clung to Naomi with a devotion that would make even a Netflix binge watcher jealous of her binge loyalty. She trudged through mud-slick roads, her boots squelching, while the wind tossed her hair like a banner of unshakable allegiance. When the harvest time arrived, Ruth's hands ripped wheat stalks, their golden scent swarming her senses, and she whispered, "Where you go, I'll go," turning a simple promise into a covenant forged in sweat. The village gossips muttered about a foreign woman daring to stake her fate on a dead-beat widow, yet Ruth's smile cut through their whispers as sharp as a scythe. Her unwavering love proved redemptive, turning a bleak story into a saga where loyalty itself becomes the hero, nudging destiny like a cosmic game controller. As the years unfurled, God's invisible hand stitched each moment together, guiding Ruth's steps like a backstage director cueing the next scene. The birth of Obed set off a chain reaction, each generation humming the same ancient lullaby of hope, until the young David swung a harp under a star-speckled sky, his voice echoing the same love that birthed him. Naomi, now gray-haired and laughing with the creak of her chair, tasted the bittersweet wine of remembrance, feeling the texture of prophecy linger on her tongue. The legacy of blessing glowed like a campfire, drawing strangers and kin alike, reminding everyone that a single act of loyalty can spark an empire. And so, the story closes with a wink to the universe. Even in dusty fields, the divine playwright never drops the script, only the mic.